I have an enviable problem. I have too much information for you. I had originally intended to condense two separate talks into this presentation and still try to leave enough time to do Q&A at the end. But unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be able to get to them. So I'm going to give you the second part first, and if there's time left over, I'll go to the first part. Various pieces of ballistic evidence were collected in the wake of the Kennedy assassination and delivered to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C., where they were cataloged and analyzed. The official story is that all of the bullets and bullet fragments recovered by the FBI were turned over to the Warren Commission in 1964. That was not the case. 40 years ago, the FBI collected and then discarded ballistic evidence it attributed to President Kennedy's head wounds. Although this bullet fragment made its way briefly into the Warren Commission's hands, it was never introduced during any Warren Commission testimony, nor was a likeness of it produced in any of the 26 supporting volumes for the Warren Commission report. That fragment was likewise not turned over to the National Archives, and if you go there as I have, you will not find it. And they don't have any idea what it is, where it was, or where it might be. The physical specimen was buried, but the burial was imperfect. In a brazen display of bureaucratic arrogance, the FBI kept its images. Indeed, like a ghost from the past, the fragment haunts us today in a photograph. The official story is that 2 bullet fragments were pulled from President Kennedy's head during the course of the autopsy. These were turned over to FBI agents Siebert and O'Neill, who attended the autopsy. Siebert and O'Neill delivered those 2 fragments to the FBI firearms identification expert in charge of the Kennedy assassination evidence, Robert A. Frazier of the FBI laboratory in Washington. The 5 contemporaneous sources of information indicating that, and this is important, 2 and only 2 bullet fragments were pulled from President Kennedy's brain during the autopsy are: the first is President Kennedy's autopsy protocol, which reported that from the surface of the disrupted cerebral cortex, 2 small irregularly shaped fragments were recovered. These measured 7 by 2 and 3 by 1 millimeter. The second is a teletype sent from the Baltimore field office by Agent Siebert and O'Neill, which reported 2 metal fragments in the brain area. One is 7 by 2 millimeters, and the other is 3 by 1. The third is the report, filed a few days later by Siebert and O'Neill, which related that 2 fragments of metal were removed by Dr. Humes, the pathologist in charge of conducting the autopsy. Again, the fragments are described as 7 by 2 and 3 by 1 millimeters. The fourth is FBI firearms expert Robert Frazier's testimony before the Warren Commission, where he stated under oath that 2 metal fragments were delivered to me in the FBI laboratory by Special Agents Siebert and O'Neill of the Baltimore field office, who had obtained them in the autopsy room. And finally, Arlen Specter received these fragments from Robert Frazier in advance of his testimony. And this is Robert Frazier's handwriting, which is all over the evidence. Here we have, and this designation C4 and C5, if you had the handout, equates to Q4 and Q5, but we'll get into that later. 2 fragments. These are the images of the headshot fragments as we have known them for 40 years. You have the Warren Commission version, which was published in 1964 as Commission Exhibit 843. You have the House Select Committee version. That's around the time of Dr. Vincent Gwynn. When he did his test, he did not alter the fragments. He didn't cut anything off of them. No aliquots were taken. This is a preservation photograph from the National Archives taken in 1988. And you can see I've scaled them all together, and I can explain that if it's necessary, but you can see that the fragments all look very similar. They're approximately the same size and shape, and it appears that they are the same fragments traveling through time. Yet among the files at the National Archives is a collection of 4 by 5 negatives that represent the FBI's official record of the Kennedy assassination evidence. It was there that I came upon this negative envelope, like many I'd seen previously. And I've been to the archives on 5 occasions for a total of 31 research days. I've been very fortunate to be able to get there for that amount of time and root through those files that are available to us thanks to Oliver Stone and the JFK Act. Inscribed on this envelope in pencil is the legend Q4 and 5, which I knew to be the FBI designation for the 2 headshot fragments. And again, Robert Frazier's handwriting. Q4 and 5 was later turned into C4 and 5. I removed the 4x5 black and white negative from the sleeve and held it up to the light. And this is not hyperbole. What I saw made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The moment was electric. And you can't really see it too well because of the sunshine. But there are 3 sizable fragments in that image. And I have, these are 4x5 prints that I had prepared by the National Archives, Marty McGann, of these images. At the bottom, again, Robert Frazier's handwriting, and you can't really see it too well in this image, but afterwards if you'd like to examine this photograph. Right here, in grease pen on the surface of the negative. Hello, Tank. Again, this is Robert Frazier's handwriting at the bottom, identifying these 3 fragments as Q4 and 5. Notice also that this was originally a 4x5 negative that someone had taken either an X-Acto knife or a pair of scissors and cut it up the middle. And when I looked at the image, I immediately wondered what's in the other half of that photograph, and it wouldn't take me long to find out. This is a high-resolution scan I made of that negative at the National Archives with a Sony Vaio laptop and an Epson scanner that is capable of scanning photographs and negatives. Again, here you see more clearly Robert Frazier's handwriting. Q4, Q5, the 2 headshot fragments that came out of President Kennedy's brain during the autopsy. And they have a scale placard. If you look closely, and you can see it in the prints, there are fingerprints on this negative, and perhaps James can do some work with that, because I suspect they're Robert Frazier's. This is an enlargement. Actually, this is a negative that I scanned at extremely high resolution, and I actually had to downsize it to fit it on here. And the image on my laptop and in that photograph is quite a bit better than what you see here, but these all have mass. You can see where they cast a shadow. This particular fragment has a very splattered look, but you can already see that you're starting to get down to the grain level. It's starting to get very choppy. For the balance of the presentation, I'm going to refer to these fragments as the first fragment, the second fragment, and the third fragment. Well, it's funny you mention that. Oh, you can't hear that? He mentioned that this particular fragment, this fragment right here in the National Archives, as it exists today, is approximately 2.5 millimeters by about 2.1 millimeters. And as Dr. Mantic wrote, it's a pancake. It's very flat. This image, again, it's not showing up very well on the screen, but this is a scan done at 3200 dpi, which is the max resolution of the scanner. And you can see that you're actually getting down to the grain level. And you can see it casts a shadow. And here are the other 2, the second fragment and the third fragment. The capabilities of the scanner that I brought to the National Archives is such that it can get very, very close. You see right here, this little object, we're going to close in on that, okay? That is a twisted piece of pericranium, the last layer between the scalp and the skull. And again, we're approaching the grain level, but you can see this image, that piece of pericranium is approximately 2 centimeters in length, which would be about that big. So the scanner copies very well. Approximately, yeah. This is, and I'm not sure, these are the FBI 4x5 negatives. I'm not sure that these have actually ever been displayed in public before. Here you have an interior view of the Harper fragment that gives you a really good sense of the convexivity, whereas the others that we've seen are generally straight down shots, and you don't get a sense of the curvature of this piece of bone. And you can see the grooves for the meningeal arteries here and some foramina. And here's a close-up. Again, the scanner works well. Now, we go back and we look at this image. I believe that the image that's in the archives, the 4x5 negative, is a photograph of a photograph. I've scanned literally thousands of negatives at the National Archives, and I have never, and to their credit, the FBI knew how to take 4x5 negatives. I've never seen one that dissolves to grain this quickly, and I believe it's a photograph of a photograph. So what are we looking at? The FBI negative includes a scale placard in the shot in close proximity to the plane of the fragments, and this allows us to measure the dimensions of the fragments if we know what the scale is. Fortunately, I ran across an original FBI placard at the National Archives, which I scanned at very high resolution, and it is exactly as it appears to be. It's an inch scale divided in 1/10 inch increments. From here to here is an inch, from here to here is an inch, and they're divided into 1/10 increments. Using the precise measure tool in Photoshop, I was able to measure these at a pretty good degree of accuracy, and there's a little bit of a question because the perspective is a little off, but they measure 4.9 by 2.3 millimeters, 2.9 by 1.1, and 2.8 by 2.4. Now recall that the fragments from the headshot were 7 by 2 and 3 by 1. This fragment is very, very close to what was pulled out of President Kennedy's head. This particular fragment is a little bit smaller. So what explains this third shot's presence? If there's an innocent explanation, this has to come from the official suite of evidence, which is a finite suite of evidence. It has to come from one of these. You have a smear of lead taken from the Tague curb. You have the stretcher bullet. You have the windshield residue. You have the nose portion of a fragment which had lead. You have the base portion of a bullet which has no lead. You have 3 fragments found by Robert Frazier underneath Nellie Connolly's jump seat. These I call the rug fragments. So by the way, I just give them names so that they'll become familiar. You have the headshot fragments, which are Q4 and 5, and all the indication is that they are 2. And then we have the Connolly wrist fragment. And I use the word fragment in the singular for a very good reason, and we'll get to that. If the third fragment's existence is innocent, it has to be some sort of mix-up between this, from this official suite of evidence. The Tague curb was a smear of lead that the FBI said that they could barely test. So none of the fragments that we've seen could be considered a smear, and the Tague curb is not the answer. The stretcher bullet. If the third fragment came from the stretcher bullet, it must have been a sample cut off for spectrographic or neutron activation analysis. And the question becomes, do any of the FBI headshot fragments resemble samples, or aliquots as they call them? This is a very poor attempt at photographing this negative. I got a really good shot of the background, but this is another of those negative envelopes. And this one actually helps us understand whether or not those fragments in the headshot picture are aliquots. This is the other half of that cut negative, and again, unfortunately, it's not very clear. But again, I had the National Archives prepare 4x5, 8x10 glossy prints of that image. Notice, and it's hard to see, but there are actually 4 fragments in that negative. This shows a little bit. Again, this is a high-resolution scan I made with the scanner. You have 3 larger fragments and a little piece over here that gives the appearance of a wedge. This line right here made me very suspicious, because Mother Nature hates a straight line. You find very few straight lines in Mother Nature, but man, on the other hand, can't do without them, and so I suspected that that might have been an aliquot where they had carved the sample. This is a high-resolution scan of that little fragment. And again, the image is better on the laptop, but it does appear to give the shape of a wedge. You can see where over here it has more mass, and it appears to be cleaved towards the right as you look at it. This is what an aliquot looks like. There's another negative at the National Archives that is far superior in quality to the ones we just looked at. These are the same fragments. This is the same side of the fragment taken from a slightly different angle. And you can see, again, it's better on the laptop, but you can actually see where it's been cut, and you can actually see the individual grooves where some of the imperfections in the scalpel that were used cut it. Now, compare that image to this image. They were both scanned on the same day with the same scanner, same laptop, at the same resolution. The quality of this one is far inferior. These are aliquots of Lot 6000 of the Western Cartridge Company 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano round that were kindly provided to me by Stu Wexler and Tom Pinkston, and you're going to hear more about these from Stu in a while. The windshield residue. Robert Frazier testified to the Warren Commission concerning what he scraped from the windshield during his examination. He said that the windshield residue was, quote, not a particle, but a residue of metal on the inside of the windshield. Now, the images that we see are not residue. They have substance, they cast shadows, they're not residue. The windshield fragment can't be where that fragment came from, the windshield residue. Could it be from the nose portion of the bullet that contained lead in the front seat? By visual inspection, the fragments in that negative are clearly not the nose fragment that came out of the limousine. And again, I apologize for not having a high quality image. That was one of the images that didn't make it to Pittsburgh. But those are readily available, and it's obvious that that fragment is not the fragment in this photograph, and we know that they're not aliquots, so it didn't come from that fragment. Now, the base portion of the bullet had no lead, according to Robert Frazier, and the pictures show that. The bullet is a casing where the lead has been dislodged, and so this particular fragment is too small to be a hunk of metal that came out of that particular bullet fragment. So it's not the lead that came out of the base. It's too small, and it's a fragment. Could the third fragment have come from the rug fragments? Robert Frazier testified before the Warren Commission that he removed 3 fragments from the rug beneath Nellie Connolly's jump seat. Aside from the small wedge, that fourth piece that we saw that resembles an aliquot, every other indication is that there were only 3 fragments associated with the rug removed from the limousine. Again, Arlen Specter accepted this evidence, and this comes from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's official evidence chain of evidence log from the Bureau to the Commission and back to the FBI. And here you see C16 is actually Q14, 3 fragments, which is exactly what was turned over to Arlen Specter. That fragment didn't come from the rug fragments. The headshot fragments. By all accounts, as we've seen, 2 and only 2 fragments were pulled from President Kennedy's head. Unless Humes, Boswell, Siebert, and O'Neill are lying about what they pulled from President Kennedy's head, nothing in that image can be from the headshot. And if we say that it is, then we have some sort of conspiracy. And it would be interesting to see if any radiologist gets back to the National Archives, if they can take a fresh look at those x-rays and see if they can identify anything that looks like that third fragment in the Kennedy head x-rays. My personal speculation is that it's not there because it didn't come from the president's head. That leaves the Connolly wrist fragment. There's some confusion as to exactly what came out of Connolly's wrist. I don't think there's any question that more than 1 fragment came out of his wrist, but the question is, how many made it to Dallas? Virtually all of the contemporaneous evidence indicates that Robert Frazier received 1 fragment associated with Connolly's wrist, regardless of how many were collected in Dallas. These include Robert Frazier's history of evidence, which we'll get to in a short while, lists the Q9 wrist fragment as 1 fragment. The FBI accounting of the evidence in its possession that it sent back to Jesse Curry on November 22nd lists the wrist fragment as 1 fragment. Frazier testified before the Warren Commission that he received 1 fragment from Special Agent Vincent Drain. Frazier and the Warren Commission continually and without exception referred to Q9 as 1 fragment. Robert Frazier physically handed that fragment over to Arlen Specter of the Warren Commission on May 13th, 1964. No one said a word about there being more than 1 fragment. Again, and this is the cover sheet to those evidence logs in the FBI files. Arlen Specter. Same date. This is the date of Robert Frazier's testimony. Q9 is C9. One fragment. Against receipt, all inspectors signed for a single fragment. Additionally, and this is unfortunately one of the slides that didn't make it, but the FBI spectrographer, John Gallagher, his notes from the neutron activation analysis that he did in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, list that as one fragment. Although multiple fragments were surely pulled from Connolly's wrist in Dallas, the clear weight of the evidence indicates that only one fragment was sent to the FBI. And a never before, I think, seen photograph is going to come up later that shows that fragment. The third fragment could not have come from Connolly's wrist. Where did it come from? Where did that third fragment come from? The third fragment was a fragment unto itself. And here we come to the most damning piece of evidence. March 16th, 1964. C4 and C5 are Q4 and Q5. Number of pieces, 3. That's exactly what the photograph shows. 3 fragments. And by the way, and unfortunately you can't see it here, but I have it in the computer. At the bottom of this document is Melvin Eisenberg's signature, not all inspector. On this particular day, Melvin Eisenberg accepted, against receipt, his own signature, 3 fragments. These fragments, at one point in time, unless there's some monumentally coincidental mix-up, these fragments made it to the Warren Commission, and they came back to the FBI on the 17th, right? That's what it says. Well, there's a problem. They didn't go back to the FBI immediately. The magic bullet, the nose bullet, and the base bullet went with John Gallagher to the Warren Commission on that same day. And there is a memo where he discusses neutron activation analysis with the Warren Commission. That neutron activation, the official one, would be 2 months down the road in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. 4, 5, 7, and 16, which is the 2 headshot fragments, and this is the rug fragments. Here we see that the windshield residue was not delivered. Jay Cochran worked under Robert Frazier at the FBI. He was the night supervisor. He checked these fragments out on 3/16, and here we see Jay Cochran's signature. He checked them out. He brought them to the Warren Commission. I've yet to be able to figure out who this guy is, and you can probably see why. Jay Cochran took those fragments out. They didn't come back until 6 days later. They weren't at the Warren Commission. They weren't at the FBI. Where did these fragments go? They took a walk. This, by the way, is Robert Neal's signature. He also worked in the FBI laboratory. Rankin was under the impression in early 1964 that the bullet fragments were being tested at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. This is several months before the bullet fragments took a walk. Robert Frazier testified 2 months later, only he didn't bring 3 fragments with him this time. He brought 2. Q4, Q5, all inspector's signature, C843, a number we're all familiar with. 2 fragments. The third fragment went away. I wish that I could tell you where they went, where it went. I wish that I could tell you where he collected it, under what circumstance. I've been through the FBI HQ files front to back. If you started right here and you stack the boxes end by end, there are 196 boxes. It would reach past the end of the crowd. That's not including the FBI bulky files where this information came from. I conducted a page-by-page search in an attempt to find any kind of information on where Robert Frazier collected this. There's nothing that I can find, and with a little luck, I'm going to get back to the archives in about another month, hopefully for an extended stay. But there's a question. And is Ben around? I forgot to set my watch. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time here. Oh, 10 minutes. Damn. Okay. There's one clue as to where these might have come from, and I call it the Q timeline problem. Okay? As the evidence was collected by Robert Fraser, here again, Robert Fraser's handwriting, Q1, Elmer Todd, on the 22nd, 7:30 p.m. The nose fragment, the base fragment, Orrin Bartlett, 11:50 at night. Notice that all of these, except for the two from Vincent Drain, have a time associated with them. Vincent Drain got Q6 through 13, and he brought some knowns. The K's are the knowns. And here we have Q14 and 15, obtained 11:23, and this is Robert Fraser's mark. This is Charles Killian. I have yet to figure out who JH is. I can't find out who that guy was. He marked the stretcher bullet, by the way, on the nose. Can't find him anywhere in the files. Doesn't mean he's not there. It means that I just haven't been able to find him. So what's the problem? Vincent Drain was a special agent out of the Dallas field office. Hoover said, get all that evidence to the FBI, chop, chop. I want it, I want it. So what they did was, there were no commercial flights leaving Dallas at that time. They crated up the evidence. Vincent Drain went to Carswell Air Force Base, and he boarded a military jet where he was spirited to Washington. Rosen to Belmont. We even have the flight number. He left at 3:55 Dallas time. He arrived in Washington 6:15 a.m. on the 23rd. Now, why is that important? Here we have, again, Robert Fraser's handwriting. Vincent Drain delivered all that stuff. Say he arrived the evidence was cataloged between 7:30 and 8. It took a half an hour to uncrate the stuff and to catalog it. 11:23, that's exactly what we find. And there's Winston Lawson, there's a document actually in the Warren Commission that confirms he actually took the flight back to Washington, and he confirms they arrived at 7:30. Why is that a problem? This represents 11:22 from approximately 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock. Q1 came in at 7, but for the sake of the diagram, I put it off to the side. The nose fragment and the base fragment arrived at Robert Fraser's office at 11:50 p.m., a few minutes short of midnight. Several hours later, at 1:45 p.m., Siebert and O'Neill arrived with the two headshot fragments. At this point, all they have is Q1 and these two. Within a short period of time, they were able to match the striations, and they were able to say that these two fragments match the magic bullet. Now, they're waiting for the rifle, and the first thing that they're going to do when the rifle gets in there is put a cartridge in, test it, and test it against the magic bullet. But now, they don't have much else to do. Gallagher's doing the spectrographic analysis. They're waiting for evidence that they don't even know yet is on the way. They didn't get a confirmation until approximately 1 o'clock. Robert Fraser travels to the White House garage at 2 o'clock in the morning, conducts his examination of the limousine, returns at 4 o'clock with the rug fragments and the windshield residue. Now, in the timeline, you have Q1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Q14, 15. Drain arrives at 8 o'clock in the morning at the FBI lab. The evidence that he brings with him is given Q number 6 through 13. This should have been Q6 and 7. What did Robert Fraser do with this evidence? The first thing the FBI does when a piece of physical evidence comes into the lab is they give it a Q number. That's how they know. Like I call the rug fragment the head. That's what I call it. They call it Q1. That way, the first thing they do, and I confirm this with Special Agent Heiberger, the first thing they do is they give it a Q number, then they photograph it, then they do whatever test they're going to do. So why does this evidence show up after this evidence? What did Robert Fraser have to do? The next piece of evidence that comes in, well, there's a Q16, which is a document which I haven't been able to find, and I don't know. It was the first document collecting the Kennedy assassination, and it also dropped off the face of the earth, as far as I can tell. So, in terms of the timeline, Drain arrives at 8 o'clock in the morning. The next piece of evidence that comes in could have come in at 7 p.m. at the earliest, and that is the Oswald fingernail scrapings. They're given Q17 and Q18. Robert Fraser had between 4 and 16 hours that he had this evidence that he pulled from the limousine in his hand. Does he catalog it? He's got nothing else to do. He doesn't catalog it. It goes into an evidentiary limbo. Why? I don't know. I don't know. And there's I'm running out of time, unfortunately, but there's funny business with his diagrams where he wrote 1964 on his diagram that is supposed to be from 63, and he erased the 4 and wrote a 3 over it. How many of us in January of a new year will write the previous date, have to scratch it out, and do that? I'll put both hands up because I do it a lot. How many of us in November of 1963 would accidentally put 64 and erase it? There's a box in the National Archives. In that box is a bunch of photographs. Not unlike this. After the Kennedy assassination ballistic evidence left the FBI's hands, it was gone forever. It was turned over to the National Archives on November 24th, 1964, after the Warren Commission closed up shop and they were done with it. All that was left to the FBI was their photographs. If J. Edgar Hoover walked into Robert Frazier's office and said, "Bob, I would like to see pictures of Kennedy assassination evidence," Robert Frazier would pull the photographs out of this box. This is the folder that they're contained in at the National Archives. This is an 8x10 photograph, the magic bullet, stretcher bullet, Robert Frazier's handwriting. The nose portion of the bullet pulled from the limousine, the base portion. Hard to see, Robert Frazier's handwriting. Again, and this is, you can see the barrel distortion. I took it with a macro photography with a digital camera. Cartridges. This image of Q9, the wrist fragment, by the way, is larger than what shows up in the Warren Commission, and I have a handout that I wanted to pass around. It's a scale image, and it just shows how over time this fragment got smaller. And thanks to Tink Thompson for this particular image right here. He was kind enough to send me that in a high-resolution file so I could include it in this diagram. And it's bigger than what ends up showing up in the Warren Commission, which is not a problem because they carve pieces off to do neutron activation analysis. So you would naturally expect that it would get smaller. If J. Edgar Hoover walked in to Robert Frazier's office in 1966 and said, "Bob, I would like to see pictures of Kennedy's headshot fragments," this is the photograph that Robert Frazier would have provided J. Edgar Hoover with. It's the same photograph. Q4, Q5, C4, C5. Frazier testified. Mr. Frazier, one additional question. And this was after he had given all the evidence to the FBI. He was on his way out the door. Mr. Frazier, one additional question. Do you have any knowledge through any source whatsoever of any bullets or bullet fragments found anywhere in the vicinity of the assassination other than those which you have already testified to, which were in the car, blah, 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 and came from Kennedy's wrist? Frazier, no, sir. I have never heard of any, nor have any been submitted to me. Robert Frazier's handwriting. The FBI liked Robert Frazier. He got a commendation. He also got some cash. He did a great job. He did such a good job with the Kennedy assassination ballistic evidence that they gave him a commendation and they gave him a bonus. They gave him cash. Robert Frazier was a good guy. As far as I understand it, Robert Frazier is alive today. The Harper fragment made its way to the FBI, and they x-rayed it. This is the first image that they took. They took a total of 6 with varying, they bombarded the Harper fragment with varying amounts of radiation. At one corner of the Harper fragment is a radiopaque density that is manifestly denser than the adjacent bone. It's not crud. You might think that the argument could be put forth, and it's a legitimate one, that it's an artifact. But in a fit of bureaucratic frugality, the FBI took 2 images on a single X-ray plate. They took the Harper fragment, they put it down, they put a lead blanket to protect the other side, they took an image. They reversed it. They put the Harper fragment over here, they put the lead fragment over here. They got 2 images on the same film. This is that second image. You can see that a lot more of the bone has gone away because the bone is, you might say, giving up the ghost. And you can't see it on here, but you can see it on the screen. If anybody wants to see it later, they can. But here's a close-up image of that. The radiopaque density is still resisting photons, but all the bone surrounding has given up the ghost. Now, you would think that that would contravene well-known radiologic principles, that the fragment didn't survive the bone. And I was going to lay it out for you, but I'm just going to give you the conclusions because I don't really have time. Here's the area that equates to that fragment on the outside of the Harper fragment taken by the FBI. Here's, I've reversed it. Here's the radiopaque density at the corner of the Harper fragment. Here it is correlated to the Harper bone fragment. Then when we blow up, if we're going to find lead or attenuation, which would be an additional thickness of bone, those are the two things that could cause this is where we would expect to find it, or on the inside, and it's not on the inside. This is the Harper fragment photograph taken in Dallas. This is actually a 4x5 color negative that the FBI made from the original transparency that was made. Here we have the interior surface, side by side. This one is a little more contrasty, but I've compared them point by point. There's nothing in this photograph that's not in this photograph. Some things, and you can't tell from this version, but this is more contrasty, but there's nothing there that isn't on the other. Here you see a little lead-like smudge, but it's not. It's all around the bone fragment. Here you see it's a little bit more accentuated. In the exact same spot, and unfortunately it doesn't show up well, but it shows up well here, there are lead smudges exactly where the X-rays tell us we're going to find lead on the Harper fragment. November 25th, Dallas. Before the FBI got their hands on this bone fragment, there's lead-like smudges that match exactly where we expect to find them on the X-ray. By the time the FBI gets to it, the lead's gone. And sure enough, the reason that lead gave up the ghost before the bone is because it was a smear of metal. I've confirmed this with two forensic radiologists whose names you might know that don't want to be quoted. But they looked at the work, they looked at the images, and they confirmed exactly what we're seeing. It's actually more damning that lead doesn't hold up because the FBI scraped it off, and you can see the lead-like smear, and that's exactly what they found.